share some of their memories. And let's start with my brother, Adam Norton.
Well, thank you all for coming here. So as most of you know, my father grew up in Maine, and I've come to realize just how much that shaped him, and in turn myself. So when he was a newborn, he caught smallpox. It was one of the very few cases in this country. Fortunately, he apparently had enough of his mother's immunity to survive. His parents were both college educated. His grandfather had been on track to get a combination BA and MD from Bowdoin, but then they canceled their MD program. And even so, his father was always known to everyone as Doc. They lived in several small towns near the coast of Maine, including Jonesport, where my father was from, where my grandfather was from, Winter Harbor, and Vanceboro. Vanceboro was on the Canadian border, and they lived for a time with my grandmother's parents in a house that was not yet equipped with 20th century improvements. The heating and cooking were all done with wood stoves. The water came from a hand pump outside. And then, of course, there was the outhouse in the winter. He was just a young child, but he learned how to saw and split wood. And he learned if you did not cut enough wood to last the winter, you would freeze. That meant filling a shed the size of a 2-car garage with cut and split logs. I'm sure he learned many other practical skills and lessons on self-reliance and endurance. As a teenager, he lived in Winter Harbor, working at the resort as a groundskeeper and a supervisor of caddies, even though most of the caddies were older than he. He went to the local high school where he soon realized he was smarter than all his teachers. It was a small school where he made the varsity basketball team because they only had 5 boys willing to play. The poor, incompetent science teacher was always the butt of mysterious mishaps that my father and his followers would engineer in the lab. The same teacher would supervise the study hall by pretending to read papers on his desk while peering through his fingers like this to make sure kids weren't misbehaving, and then all the kids would peer back like that. I'm convinced that this teacher cultivated my father's complete intolerance for fools and stupid bureaucracy. My father also probably learned that he was his own best teacher. He was surrounded by many people who were capable and had common sense, but mostly people in Washington County, Maine, were occupied by scratching out a living rather than absorbing academic knowledge. He may have felt that it was on his shoulders alone to get everything right and carry forward that academic knowledge as perfectly as he could. When World War II ended, he said he felt really mad that he had missed out because he was too young. Then he entered Bowdoin College in 1946, along with the first wave of older and world-weary, battle-damaged returning veterans. One of these was his brother Dick, who he roomed with. Dick was in the invasion of Italy and had seen much combat. Dick and his friends gave him a very different sort of education around whiskey-soaked poker tables about life and the realities of war. And when the Korean War came around, he no longer had any desire to sign up and did all he could to stay out. Of course, academically, he studied science and chemistry, but he seems to have had a great interest in poetry as well. I always noticed the relatively large number of old poetry books around the house. And then when cleaning out his papers, I found some of his original poetry from many years ago that I never had known about. He went on to graduate school in chemistry at Princeton, living not far from Albert Einstein, that is the person, not the medical school he would later work at. And one day, walking down the street, he noticed Einstein was walking on the other side of the street. Einstein saw him staring, and instead of ignoring this young student, he waved to him like they were old friends. Another time, my father went to a lecture on quantum mechanics, and in walks Einstein. People notice him, but he sits down in the audience without making much of a scene. And then in walks Robert Oppenheimer, who was making a disruptive, grand entrance and sits down only when he's sure everyone notices him. I think this made an impression on my father of the type of elder scientist he would rather be. After earning his doctorate, he gets a job at DuPont in Wilmington, Delaware, working on polymers, that is, plastics. This was not his particular interest, but being a critical employee at a defense contractor, he would be protected from the draft. He actually had been about to take a job as an officer in the U.S. Public Health Service Corps. It required one small formality. He had to pass the military induction physical for military officers. He had already had his regular induction physical and had been rated 1A. As it turned out, though, his eyeglass prescription was just a bit out of date, and he could not pass the slightly higher vision standards for officers. No redos were allowed. So if not for this seeming bit of misfortune, he would not have met my mother in Wilmington, and he likely would not have met later her acquaintance who gave him his start in neurochemistry. My mother, Lila, was working at the time as a psychologist at a mental institution in Wilmington. He once wrote he was attracted by her prickly honesty, or words to that effect. They were certainly from very different backgrounds. She grew up in the Bronx from a Jewish family of immigrant parents, but both their families valued learning highly, even while they were poor in material wealth. He stayed at DuPont until 1957, quitting in a fit of anger one day. He was tired of the typical corporate incompetence and BS that many of us are too familiar with, and that we would probably suffer more readily than he. I believe it was my mother who knew someone who knew Saul Corey, who was the head of the new Department of Neurology at Einstein College of Medicine. Saul was looking for a chemist to round out the research faculty in the department, and thus began my father's career in neurochemistry, having never taken a course in biology. Others here can probably say more about his professional life. I think it's safe to say he accomplished quite a lot in the chemistry of myelin, that's the insulation of nerve fibers, developing a technique to isolate myelin that was and maybe still is widely used. He was interested in the causes of multiple sclerosis and the effects of inflammation in the brain. He was the author of more than 140 papers. He served as journal editor, reviewed papers and grant application, was the recipient of numerous honors, and trained many postdoc researchers. Soon after he joined Einstein, my parents started their family, and my father traded in his Jaguar XK sports car for a Rambler station wagon. My earliest memories of his lab were walking through the dim corridors that smelled strongly of chemicals and pipe smoke. There were open shelves lining the halls stacked full of chemical bottles and bizarre equipment. So if us kids had to spend time there, we might be entertained by the technicians with glass-blowing demonstrations or lessons on pipe heading. All of this was very exciting to a kid with a scientific bent. When I was in college, I came back to his lab to work one summer for no pay under Alex True, and my dad was trying to convince me to get into biochemistry instead of physics. He asked a bit what I was doing those days, and his main advice was, don't screw it up. I think he meant by that first I was smart enough to learn how to do these things, and that science, bad science, is worse than worthless. So don't screw it up. Science was always important in our house. We definitely grew up with the impression that science and an understanding of the workings of life and the universe were the most important things. Everything else was peripheral. We were reminded of that by the books and magazines lying around the house, the toys we were given, the dinner discussions. One of my favorite things was making my Christmas wish list from the Edmunds Scientific Catalog. Our pets were even white rats he rescued from the lab.
I don't know if I'd call that rescuing them.
They might have felt otherwise, given the fate they might have otherwise had. When his lab's old mechanical calculator became obsolete, rather than throwing it out, he brought it home for Hamish and I to disassemble and reverse engineer. When we were young, my mother was always a little jealous of his jaunts to the international conferences while she took care of us kids. Then one year in 1967, we all four accompanied him on a sabbatical to London, where we lived for a year. During the summer and winter breaks, we toured through Europe. I usually went sightseeing with my mother, while Hamish went with my father. I was bored to death as my mother carefully examined each and every art treasure in every art museum in Europe. And I was very envious that Hamish got to do all the fun stuff with my dad, like climbing to the top of cathedrals or seeing cool Roman ruins. But I did have fun camping in our Volvo, which is how we traveled that summer. Hamish and I were on the roof tent on top of the car, and my parents were in the back of the wagon. I think my dad enjoyed that too. I'm not so sure about my mother. When we came back to the States, we settled in Westport, Connecticut. My mother and father had lived there for a short time in the late 50s, when it still probably resembled a bucolic artist's colony. By 1968, it had already changed into a more upper-class bedroom community, and I think both my parents felt less a part of that community than they thought they might. As a new suburban homeowner, he seemed to enjoy doing home projects himself. Or perhaps growing up in the Depression trained him not to waste money paying someone else to do what he could do himself. With a little reading, he could do a lot, and taught us too. My father, Hamish, and I replaced the whole roof on the house. This was when I was 11. I also helped him completely renovate the hall bathroom. He built the living room bookshelves himself. He used expensive wood for that and was very proud of those shelves. When my parents put on a kitchen addition, my mother took on the job of general contractor, and my father did much of the work himself. This included installing the large slabs of granite countertop without any help. I asked him how he managed that, and he said he just thought about how the ancient Egyptians might have moved those stones. Car repair was another thing that did not scare him, although he did not like to take on major jobs. But once we were in Cambridge dropping Hamish off at college after a winter break, it was very cold. We had checked out of the Holiday Inn, packed up the car to go home, but the car would not start, even with a boost. So there I was with my dad in the lobby of the Holiday Inn, cleaning and gapping spark plugs, filing the ignition points. Essentially, we were giving the car a tune-up. Eventually it started, but maybe it's just because the air warmed up a bit. Much of the time, though, I remember him coming home from work, having a drink, having dinner, then going upstairs, working in his office until The Tonight Show came on. It seemed that there were always grant applications and papers to write, and even more grants and papers to review. He took his professional obligations very seriously, just like the need to cut enough wood for the winter. He still took time to help me with my schoolwork now and then. He could help with essay writing equally well as math or chemistry. He took pride in being a good writer. He also taught us how to hit and catch baseballs, how to shoot rifles, how to shoot arrows. He seemed to know everything. I was quite flattered then once when he asked my help as he was learning about personal computers. After my brother and I were grown, it seemed that my father spent even more time going to conferences all over the world. Usually my mother went along too. I cannot begin to list all the countries. I think he very much enjoyed this part of being a senior scientist and the minor fame it brought. Once in Vienna, a group from the conference were touring Sigmund Freud's house. My dad was talking to another scientist when Woody Allen, the filmmaker, comes in accompanied by a tall, stunning blonde, attracting some attention. At the very same time, my mother was across the room standing next to two younger fellows when one of them says, "Hey, isn't that Bill Norton?" One of his favorite meetings was the Winter Conference on Brain Research. It was always held at a ski resort with session times that did not conflict with the lift hours. Hamish and I both went on several of those trips skiing with some of you here. He skied well into his 70s. He also took up motorcycle riding again after we were grown. The first time he came to work with his leather jacket and helmet, many thought it was a prank. He had to show them the motorcycle in the parking lots. It seemed so out of character, but really it was a large part of his character. His surgery for an abdominal aneurysm probably precipitated his retirement a little earlier than he would have liked. He never had the same mental sharpness after that. My mother and he still traveled widely. In between, they spent life quietly in Westport, reading the New York Times and doing the crossword. They would split the puzzle in half and each do their section in ink with almost no corrections. When my mother died, I think he was very lonely. He no longer traveled internationally. He would, though, take trips to Maine about twice a year, revisiting all the places he knew. He spent some weekends with Hamish's family at their house in Sheffield, and a couple of trips to visit us in California. Mostly, though, he settled into the same routine in Westport. He kept in touch with a few long-distance friends and the neighbors, but mostly did not socialize. Normally, he strictly metered his whiskey consumption to 2 drinks a day, but as his dementia progressed, he would forget and drink much more. Of course, this did not help his brain. When it was clear to us that he could not care for himself much longer, we tried to convince him to come live with us in California, and he adamantly refused several times. But by the time he reached a crisis point and we had to intervene, he was beyond our ability to take care of him. In his last year and a half, his dementia progressed rapidly. We found a place for him, Sunrise Senior Living, near us in Palo Alto. He usually thought he was in a hotel in Maine. Sometimes he was thinking he was on one of his trips to Maine, or later that Sunrise was his own rather large house. When asked, he did not remember ever living in Connecticut, or for that matter, much of his life. But he usually remembered people and places from his youth in Maine. Often we would visit him outside on the patio. On several occasions, he would point to a small sit-down volleyball net they had in the corner and say, "You know, my father made that." And the next day, we'd visit and he'd say, "You know, my father made that." And I could not figure out what he really meant by that. It obviously triggered some meaningful memory. And then I recall he used to tell stories fondly of his father teaching him how to make similar-looking nets for lobster traps. So I cannot end without thanking my wife, Mary Ann, who went way beyond the call of duty, taking on the role of his legal conservator, handling his finances and the sale of the house. Also for being his companion so many days when I found it too emotionally draining to visit. I also want to thank his neighbors, Bill and Jennifer Foster, who looked after him and helped him in so many ways. And finally, I want to thank the staff at Sunrise who took such good care of him.
So I don't want to give the impression that we're monopolizing the podium, but I'm going to read a few memories and give people in the audience some time to think about what you should think about what you want to say. So I'm trying to do you a favor, not hog the time. So let me share some memories. And I'll be a bit briefer than Adam, but Adam took on the heavy burden of doing a biography. My earliest reliable memory of my father is from when I was 5 years old. My father was a smoker. He had been since he was 13. But for me, he had a plan. He lit a cigarette for me. He showed me how to inhale. He asked me to smoke the cigarette until it was all used up. I felt great until I didn't. I turned green. I vomited. I never wanted to smoke a cigarette again as long as I lived, and I haven't. Around the same time, he brought home a set of snapped-together atoms for molecular modeling. It was a great little kit. And he showed me how to make simple hydrocarbons. Now, I was 5. Then he showed me how to make them into acids and alcohols. Then he showed me how to make inorganic acids. I got really good at this sort of chemistry. I could synthesize any acid you could name, pretty much. I liked it a lot. I certainly could not do it now. My next clear memory is from when I was about 6. My father was teaching me how to shoot. I was using his single-action Ruger .22 caliber revolver. He had once used this revolver to kill a rattlesnake that had entered the cabin that he and my mother were sleeping in during a hike up Mount Katahdin in Maine. I learned that later. The task was to shoot an empty beer bottle floating on 40-foot deep water at my aunt's quarry pool. The gun was cocked and ready. My right arm was relaxed, hanging at my side while I planned my shot. My father shouted, "Don't point it that way, you could shoot yourself in the foot." I, an avid consumer of televised cartoons, thought, what's the big deal about shooting myself in the foot? But I raised the revolver and did sink the beer bottle, maybe not on the first shot, I don't remember. But I'm glad I did not shoot myself in the foot that day. My next clear memory is from when I was about 7. I was sick, and I had a fever. I must have been hyperventilating. I said to my father, "It feels like when I breathe, the air is escaping out my belly." And my father very calmly replied, "You know that's impossible, right?" I agreed and started to feel better. He said, "You are breathing too fast. The cure is to breathe into a paper bag." He got me a paper bag, and the incident that had alarmed me was quickly over. When I was in high school, my father gave me a Miranda camera that he had had for many years. He also gave me a bellows for it that allowed the lens to be extended to focus very close and allow for very large magnification. He also gave me a table that he had painstakingly calculated and carefully written, probably before I was born, giving the magnification and the increase in the effective f-stop in increments as the bellows were extended for the 2 lenses he had. I used that bellows and that carefully calculated table to take many frightening pictures of individual eyelashes of my classmates in high school. It is a pity that neither have survived to be given to my son Henry when he enters high school. One day when I was a junior banker at Lazard, I was at my parents' house in Westport. I needed to get to a party being thrown by a more senior colleague in Greenwich. My father offered to take me on his new Suzuki 650cc motorcycle. It was a smoother ride than I expected. My host, however, thought that my arrival had cut $50,000 from the value of his property. My father was able to take care of himself until the final 1.5 years of his life. He died a month short of his 90th birthday. The assisted living facilities that he needed in his last year and a half weaned him off alcohol and tobacco. And that is as good a guess for the proximate cause of death as we have. But he had a good run. Now, again, in the interest of giving people as much time as they need to put together their remarks, I'll read a few things that I got by email from people who cannot attend for one reason or another. I have short pieces from my older son and daughter, Nina and Will and Nina. And as you'll be able to tell from what they wrote, my father gave them a pretty consistent picture of himself as between the two of them. Nina first. My clearest memories of Grandpa were when he would come to stay with us for the weekend in the Berkshires. William and I would wait on the lawn all morning until we heard the rumbling of his silver car on the driveway. He usually brought something with him on his visits, a compact disc or old magazines, or something old of my dad's like his toy car collection or his penny collection, a wood carving, or once my grandmother's old paint set. William and I would amuse ourselves with the toys during the day, and then at 5 o'clock we would listen to the compact disc while dinner was being prepared, and Grandpa went outside to have his cigarette. My memories of those dinners are that they were warm and comfortable. We often listened to the same stories about his childhood in Maine, but they never bored me. I didn't know Grandpa very well, but I knew that his earliest memory was clinging to his mother's back as she swam. She was a beautiful swimmer, he said. I knew that his childhood home didn't have any heat, and one winter he woke up feeling warmer than usual because there was a layer of snow over the foot of his blanket acting as an insulator. His dog had a tab at the local drugstore to buy ice cream. It's through nights in Sheffield and stories like this that I know Grandpa. He loved Maine, Billie Holiday, K.D. Lang, a cigarette on the patio, a slightly warm glass of red wine at dinner. And now from my son Will, who wrote what he wrote without seeing Nina's piece. Will says, a few years ago I began to realize that I knew less about Bill Norton's adult life and work than I wanted to. I had known he was a neurochemist, but I didn't know much else. I have since learned more about his fundamental research in myelination, but I still wondered how I hadn't known about that earlier. But on further thought, it made more sense. The Grandpa I knew was not primarily a scientist, he was a man from Maine. Growing up, I knew that he had a big beard, a Swiss Army knife, and a pack of cigarettes. He did the crossword, took pictures, and liked scotch. He told stories about growing up in Maine and taught me how to burn leaves with a magnifying glass. To me, a boy born in 1998, these things made Grandpa cool in a way completely different from anything I had otherwise experienced. He seemed comfortable with a simpler, more outdoors life, and I really admired that. His stories about Maine were always my favorites. They were not expertly told, but the events he related were so interesting that they resonated with me strongly. The ones which stand out to me as my favorites are the simplest, and they usually captured a very small moment in time. The first was about the time that Grandpa woke up on a winter morning after a big snowstorm. Feeling warmer than usual, it turned out that his window had opened and a drift of snow had formed on his bed. It's hard to describe how badly I wanted to wake up to a drift of snow on my bed after I heard that story. But it's something that is in the back of my mind whenever it snows. The other was about his dog, Pete, that had an account at the ice cream shop so that he could get a scoop now and then. I loved the idea of a dog walking into the shop by himself to get an ice cream. I think Grandpa understood the appeal these stories had to me. They were a glimpse into a world very different from the one I knew, and described moments which he clearly cared a lot about. He didn't talk to me a lot about his work because I wasn't old enough to really care, but the appeal of Maine was clear to me, so he talked about that. I will always carry his love for Maine with me in these stories, and do so gladly. Now, a letter from Cedric Rain, who worked at Einstein with my father. Bill Norton's passing last December had a profound effect on me, in that not only did it mark the end of a very close relationship, but it also brought to a close a journey at Einstein that began one Saturday morning in June 1968. It was the day after I arrived in the USA from England. My mentor-to-be, Bob Terry, was showing me around Einstein for the first time. And as we passed an open door, we came upon Bill busily unpacking boxes he had shipped from London, where he had just finished a sabbatical. Bob introduced us to one another. Bill, a renowned professor and pioneering expert in the neurochemistry of myelin. Myself, a beginning postdoctoral fellow in experimental neuropathology. And then left us to become acquainted. Amazingly, during the following few minutes, Bill was able to remove the enormous gap between our academic ranks to a relaxed level that allowed us to explore areas of common interest and overlap in myelin and glial cell biology and structure, and how we may apply our combined knowledge and skills through collaboration. I came away from that meeting turbocharged with the feeling that indeed I had something to contribute to science, and that in addition to Bob Terry's neuropathology group, I had discovered a wonderful colleague with whom I could expand my horizons. Over the years, although Bill and I developed independent collaborations with many laboratories within Einstein and beyond, the scientific relationship we forged that day was unparalleled and special. Our respective students and research trainees, many of whom we co-mentored, had full access to the two of us and our laboratories, creating a rich environment from which several well-equipped scientists and many milestone papers would emerge. Bill epitomized congeniality and made coming into work an enjoyable event. He was a delight to work with and a unique individual in many regards, a quintessential and honest scientist, a patient and quiet teacher, a vivid and engaging storyteller, a good listener, and a collaborator par excellence for pulling his weight. We sat through many sessions assembling and fleshing out the specific aims for research proposals, or putting the finishing touches to manuscripts, at the end of which he might have said something like, "Well said, let's see if they like that," before reaching down to his lower left desk drawer for us to have a celebratory nip of single malt whiskey. Neuroscience has lost an outstanding pioneer, and I have lost a dedicated friend and loyal colleague, one who unselfishly helped give me some of the confidence I needed to make it in academia. I know many of my colleagues, some present at this gathering, will concur, speak similarly, and smile at the ways in which Bill made our lives just that little bit brighter. And then Bob Yu writes, "Dear Hamish and Adam, I am writing to express my deepest regret for not being able to attend the celebration of life and memory of your father, Dr. William T. Norton, or Bill as he was affectionately remembered by his friends and colleagues. As you might know, I have had some health issues that have severely affected my balance. Without the company of my wife, Helen, who recently suffered from 2 falls, we felt that it would not be easy to travel long distances, especially at this time when we are experiencing a period of inclement weather and uncertain transportation schedules. Helen and I would like you to know that we feel terribly sorry we will miss this occasion, but our hearts are with you. I first met Bill at the end of 1966 when I joined Bob Ledine's lab as a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Neurology at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, the Bronx, shortly after I received my PhD degree from Herb Carter at the University of Illinois. I was very fortunate to join the department at that time as the founding chairs, Dr. Saul Corey, had the vision in developing a clinical department with a strong basic sciences program. He recruited Bill, Bob, and CUNY Suzuki as the core basic scientists, who also performed the function of a mentorship team for students, postdoctoral fellows, and junior faculty. After Dr. Corey died prematurely, the new chair, Dr. Robert Katzman, continued the same path. Shortly thereafter, Pierre Morel joined the department. The laboratories of Maurice Rapport, Barry Bloom, Cedric Rain, Henrik Wisniewski, Bob Terry, Don Purpura, and many others were all close by, making Einstein one of the most effective centers for neuroscience research and education. During those early years, cutting-edge research was done and new discoveries were reported almost monthly. Bill, with his clear thinking and brilliant mind, was always in the midst of those exciting discoveries. His own scientific accomplishments, notably in myelin and glia biology research, which are well recognized, helped in influencing the direction of early neurochemical research and the establishment of the American Society of Neurochemistry. Trained as organic chemists, Bill and Bob both recognized the importance of basic research in a clinical setting. I was very fortunate at that time working on the chemistry and biological functions of brain gangliosides, an area that was in its infancy. That was a long and most important and formative stage of my career in neurochemical research. Bill's love of science was legendary and inspired many of his academic offspring who surrounded him at Einstein. He set a high mark for them to achieve. He was genuinely interested in education, training many clinicians, medical students, and postdoctoral fellows in his laboratories. He had a way of bringing out the best in each of the trainees who came his way. He always looked to instruct his students beyond mere science and was genuinely concerned that the whole person be educated. An anecdote might serve as an example. He had a young scientist proposing to isolate myelin from earthworms. It quickly became apparent after arrival that he did not have the necessary skills to perform lab research. Bill had to let him go and advised him to perform clinical work instead. It turned out to be the best advice for this young scientist, and he later became a world-renowned clinician and writer. In fact, many of Bill's academic offspring are leaders in the scientific community, a testament to his instruction in and enthusiasm for education and research. After leaving Einstein, I have stayed closely in touch with Bill until the final days of his passing, seeking his advice and guidance all those years. He and his lovely wife, Lila, were the most caring persons I have had the good fortune to be acquainted with. They were genuinely concerned with and provided unflagging support to my career. For this I am truly grateful. His loss is immeasurable and he will be sorely missed. With deepest sympathy, Bob Yu. So now, if others are, do you want to read from Celia Brosnan?
Sure.
Yeah. And anything you want to say as well.
So Celia Brosnan cannot be here today, and she sent a few words with me. Dear Hamish and Adam, I'm so sorry I'm not able to join you to commemorate Bill's life and accomplishments, but I'm laid up in a rehabilitation center recovering with a broken ankle. I remember writing many a grant successfully, thankfully, and papers together with Wendy and Bill on proteases and demyelination projects. I particularly remember one grant for which we've written independent sections and coming back to read it several years later, only to find that I couldn't tell who had written what, as it went together seamlessly. These sessions were enlivened by the many funny jokes and reminiscences that Bill regaled on us, with in fact the easiest way to locate Bill on the first floor was to listen to Bill's laughter and follow its source. Bill Norton was a very special friend and colleague. So I'm Bridget Chaffetz-Zagardo. I'm at Albert Einstein, and I first met Bill in September 1983. I had been hired as an assistant professor in the pathology department as a result of my experience in molecular biology and cloning. And at that time, I was studying Alzheimer's disease, but I was very interested in multiple sclerosis and myelin repair. And I was introduced to Bill by Celia. I met with Bill because I wanted to determine if the protein I was studying at the time was expressed in myelin. And I knew very well that Bill was an expert in myelin isolation from multiple species, and his methods were used by everyone in the field. Initially, I was intimidated to drop in on Bill to get clarification of a step or to find out about a reagent, and yet Bill was always welcoming and helpful. He would sit at his desk and chain smoke with an overflowing ashtray and want to know about how my projects were going. At the time, he would say that some of my ideas were too ambitious, and the field had not gotten to the point where my hypothesis could be tested. Other times, he was very supportive. I always had great respect for Bill's opinions and his advice. When I began at Einstein, I had just had my first child in July. It was great having Bill as a source of knowledge, since I didn't need to spend that extra time tracking down protocols and going through the literature and working everything out, because Bill knew everything about myelin. Bill was brilliant. He was also a very kind and soft-spoken man who had many outside interests. He would always tell us about his open road adventures to Maine and about his BMW motorcycle. I remember once meeting Bill and his wife at an ASN meeting in Boston many years later. Bill knew all the activities that my husband could take our then 2 children to while I was attending the meeting. My kids, now in their 30s, still talk about the duck boat ride and how much they enjoyed it and how Bill had recommended that afternoon outing to them. I missed Bill when he retired, and while we didn't keep in touch often, we did chat, and I know he helped to shape my career, and I thank him for the time we would spend chatting and advising the somewhat bleary-eyed assistant professor who would arrive at work with just a few hours of sleep and an infant at home.
So the floor is open to anyone who would like to come up and say a few words.
Well, I wasn't going to say anything today, and then I realized it was Groundhog Day. So we know that Bill didn't really have much appreciation for popular culture, and there are very few movies I can think of that he liked. And the only one actually I can think of is Groundhog Day. So that's the one, you've probably seen it. Bill Murray plays this curmudgeonly weatherman who's sent to Pennsylvania to cover the story, does the groundhog see his shadow, and then there's a storm. And he's stuck in this small town in Pennsylvania, and he finds he's living the same day over and over again. It's a great movie. Bill always appreciated it. And I started to think that the last year or so of his life may have been something like Bill Murray's Groundhog Day. His repetition, as he was losing his short-term memory, everything was new to him again. It was hard to watch Bill decline. It was hard for us, and it was especially hard for him. And he tried to do it with as much grace as I think anyone could. I have a couple of memories of Bill that I'll just share, and who knows why these stuck out for me. One was Thanksgiving. He and Lila were having a big party in Westport, and everyone was seated around that long dining room table that they had. And I was there with my son, who was about 1.5 or 2, very fussy. Everyone was seated at the table. I was off dealing with my cranky kid, and by the time I got him settled, I came into the dining room. Everyone was seated. There was no open spot for me. I didn't know what to do. I was kind of embarrassed with my kid who's causing such a fit. I thought, oh God, how do I handle this? And he just quickly realized I was uncomfortable, got a seat for me without disturbing a lot of people, and just made what could be an awkward situation really easy. And I just will say too that characteristic stayed with him, because even as he was losing his memory and much of what made his personality Bill's, at sunrise I would go see him a lot, and for a while he liked these donuts, these Krispy Kreme donuts. And so I would bring, what do? How do you entertain somebody there? So I'd always bring this giant box of Krispy Kreme donuts, and sometimes other people would be there and we'd pass them out, and Bill would never start eating his donuts or be comfortable at all until everybody had a donut and was comfortable, and then he would start eating his own donuts. So just this sense of inclusion and caring for people stayed with him till the end. And then my final story, I don't know why it sticks with me, is also Jim was about 2, we were visiting in Connecticut, and this was summertime, and the deer tick situation was, coming from California, deer ticks were this thing I was really afraid of. And all of a sudden, we look and see my little kid's chubby neck, there's this deer tick. And okay, be calm, oh, what do I do? And then, there's Grandpa, he just pulls the tweezers out of his little knife that he keeps in his pocket, takes my son, flips him over his lap, pulls out the deer tick, and it's done. And so I just remember those things about Bill, he saved me.
I'm Mike Shalansky, and I arrived at Albert Einstein in 1967. Bill was away. There were rumors about this guy. I went to work for Bob Terry, who was a good friend of Bill Norton's, but very different personality. They both were heavy smokers at the time. So it was interesting, this was very early in my career. I finished my PhD, I was doing a residency in pathology, and I actually arrived maybe 6 months ahead of Sutter Crane. And when you arrive in this situation, you won't admit it to yourself. You really don't know how to behave. You're really uncomfortable, but you know you can't show weakness, especially in the Bronx. I'm not a New Yorker, so this was doubly tight. And I can't tell you what a relief it was when Bill came. And here was this soft-spoken, often rather cynical, bearded countenance, who was willing to listen and willing to give advice. We only published one paper together, but over the years, as I left Einstein and really lost contact with people from Einstein, it was constantly, when one went through life, to see the people Bill had trained, people who had worked with him, in my field of neuropathology, just to mention Jim Goldman, who is off traveling to South Asia right now, how Bill's influence through his students, through his work, continued all the time. But for me, what I remember most about Bill and I value most was the welcoming, the alternative to the challenge I was constantly getting from Bob. And this has stuck with me all the time, and I thank him for that.
Sandy?
I can picture Dr. Norton, Bill Norton, sort of tipped back in his chair in a tweed jacket, graying beard even then, and smoking a pipe, and there's a wry laugh that he had, and it was just wonderful. I'm Sandy Kleiman, and I grew up in the Bronx. It was a straight shot down Eastchester Road between where I grew up and Albert Einstein College of Medicine. My mother was a ward clerk at Bronx Municipal Hospital, so I knew roughly what the geography was. And it's 1969, and I had gotten into Bronx Science, and I'd gotten the letter, and I had misread it. And the letter said, you've got to do some kind of science project. And I said, oh shit, I don't know what we're here. Scarlet language, it's okay. And I went, I took the bus, and I walked into what is today, I don't know what they call it, the Earth Sciences Building. And in a pre-9/11 world, you could just walk in the building and then go up to an office. And I walked into Dr. Norton's office. And irrationally, I said, can I just stay here and do experiments? And he said, yes. And I spent 6 years between junior high school, and college. In fact, it was the early days of understanding the myelin sheath. when Hamish, lists the people who were there, that's a murderer's row of neurosciences at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine at the time. I think Bill had identified monogalactosyl diglyceride as one of the components of the myelin sheath, and there I was at age, 14, 15, taking brains, putting them in a blender, pipetting noxious liquids, sitting in front of a gas liquid chromatograph, and all times I found a way to fall asleep and set the timer so that the experiment ended and I would wake up, given what was going on. And I actually, my Westinghouse project was actually looking for digalactosyl diglyceride, which was another component which I don't think we ever found in the myelin sheath, but was an amazing experiment. But the point is, I wouldn't be standing here. I grew up, my parents hadn't gone to college. I was introduced into a world, Dr. Levine, others, you'd sit around with people who were wildly educated, wildly thoughtful, from all over the world, sharing a love of science. And the way to get out of the Bronx is actually to be good at science. And I don't think I would have gone to Harvard. I don't think I would have gone to anywhere in my career. And in fact, knowing I was just at the World Economic Forum, and people said, what are you doing when you get home? And I said, I'm going to the memorial for a man who changed my life. And one person, I'm just one of many people whose lives he changed, but one person can change a life in a way that is profound. My son is here. None of this would have been possible without Bill Norton. And when I think about the notion of paying it forward, I start with Bill Norton.
I'm Bob Ledeen. It was my privilege to work in a lab right next to Bill's for many years. In fact, I was trying to count the number of years. It was at least 2 decades that I shared departmental space in a lab right next to Bill. It was my good fortune when I was recruited into that department by salt chlorate that Bill was already a settled member of the department, and he was there to help adjust this naive young organic chemist, as Bill had been an organic chemist himself, to this whole new environment. I was totally terrified by the experience because I knew nothing about neuroscience. And Bill was really the ideal person to make you feel welcome and relaxed and realize you were about to embark on a whole new experience in your life. So I found Bill was really the quintessential scientist, neuroscientist, in so many ways, that he was the go-to person when people had questions, not just about his own field, but about other areas of neuroscience. He seemed to remember everything he ever read or heard in the field, and was able to help myself and so many others in that way. I do want to mention my friend Bob Yu, who's already been mentioned here. His statement has been read. Bob expressed to me and asked me to convey, again, his disappointment in not being able to come to this occasion on the bill. Bob was one of the most wonderful members of our former group as far as keeping in touch with everyone. And he kept in touch with Bill over the years, had conversations with him. And it was his deep regret to come here and express his gratitude and fondness for Bill. And he asked me to convey that to you, which I'm happy to do. One of the things I recall was collaborating with Bill. Bill was working in glial cells, and I was working in neurons, and it was like the train will never meet, but in fact it did meet because we embarked on a collaborative study, and Bill was the quintessential collaboration person, and we had this puzzlement that emerged from our work, which was the ganglioside, which is what I was interested in, which are abundant in neurons, and also in the glial cells that he was interested in when you isolate them from brain. And yet, when you grow these cells in culture, you find that the neurons do grow their ganglion sides very well, but the glial cells do not. So how did they get there when you isolate from whole body? And we did a study that gave an answer to that. And Bill was just delighted, and he said, "Do you think people will believe us?" And I said, "Absolutely," because the experiments that we planned were carefully designed in which Bill had a great part, of course. And we checked it as many ways as we could to make sure that we were reporting something that was real and of some interest to our colleagues, hopefully. So as the years went on, the time came when Bill was going to retire, and I asked him with great puzzle, "Well, you don't have to retire anymore at a certain age, Bill. Are you sure you want to do this?" And his answer was definitely in the affirmative. But we had a very nice farewell party for Bill. This was at a meeting of the American Society for Neurochemistry, in which Bill was very active. In fact, he was elected as president of that society in recognition of his accomplishments and abilities. And this society had a large dinner attended by many people to pay tribute to Bill. And my job was to write some poetry, which I didn't normally do, but I felt this was an occasion in which I couldn't decline. So I put together this little poem. I won't read the whole thing to you, but it does summarize some of Bill that you've been hearing about. It's called Recollections of an Unrepentant Researcher. Bill's soliloquy, as if Bill himself is telling the story. So it starts out, "Now I arrive at my 68th year, about to reflect on a lifelong career. Born in the land of ice, snow, and blizzards, famous for lobsters and myelin wizards. As a youth, I was drawn to chemistry and math. Fumes and vile odors I saw as my path. First Norton, then Princeton for graduate studies, with learned professors and billiard room buddies. It was a little known fact that Bill, in fact, was a billiard champion at Princeton, and he was part of the team that won the championship in 1952. So that's, I think, an important part of Bill's life. Indicating that when he undertook things that were not really in the world of science, he could be very good at that as well. When he went to DuPont right after graduating from Princeton, and free radicals then became his major enthrall. Then he took a trip to the Bronx one day where he met Saul Corey and otherwise monks. They told me, "Young man, it really is true. You too can become a neural guru. We need guys like you," Big Saul said to me, Saul Corey. "Our field will advance with more chemistry." So I hastened to Einstein, alert and clean-shaven, eager to become a myelin maven. With colleagues like Katzman, Scheinberg, and Terry, imposing figures, awesome and scary, and so on. So he gives tribute to the magic hands of Shirley and Farouk. Those were technicians in his lab who turned out many of the beautiful results that he published. He had some help, I mentioned, from the immunoclique, which was Celia, as we mentioned, and Murray, Bruce Bornstein, and omniscient Cedric, that's Cedric Rain, who's been mentioned. My colleagues, to me, did the journal entrust, and hundreds of manuscripts soon bit the dust. He really wasn't that tough, but he was a very good editor-in-chief of the Journal of Neurochemistry. I served ASN, American Society for Neurochemistry, on the governing team. No spicy scandals in my regime. That was at a time when there were spicy scandals being revealed about our leadership in Washington. So the research continued on Q. Many papers were published, some of them true. And that was a little joke, sort of, because if there was one thing Bill was noted for, it was the accuracy and truth of his reporting. Sweet milk did flow from the NIH cow in those days. Playing the grant game because the cats meow. But the times they have changed. My colleagues are blue. The NIH, in fact, was becoming a much more competitive place to apply for grants. What once gave us milk now gives us moo. He ends by saying, I've had a full life, and not all in science. Whiskey, wild women, that was a bit of a exaggeration. And even cigarettes. I did it all, and I have no regrets. And Bill thanked me by writing a poem of his own, which unfortunately I couldn't find. But it was in the same light of thanks for all the things that were true and not true in your poem. So I have many fond memories of Bill. I was sorry to lose him as a valued colleague. I did stay in touch with him for a number of years. And I mentioned Bob, you, my first postdoc ever, who was really the champion as far as staying in touch. And one thing about Bob that I remembered was that he shared something very important with Bill. They had the same birthday. If I'm not mistaken, that was a week ago when Bill would have turned 90. And it happens also to be Mozart's birthday. So they were both very proud of that association, having chosen Mozart's birthday to have their own birthday. And I always complimented them on that. So with that, I am so happy that Hamish and Norton have, Hamish and Adam, I'm sorry, have organized this tribute to Bill, because there are so many people who remember Bill with fondness, with love, with appreciation for all that he did for all of us. Thank you.
So I realized that I forgot to print out a note from Jim Goldman, but I have it on my phone. Phones are remarkable things. So Jim writes, I first met Bill in 1976 when I was looking for a year's postdoctoral fellowship in the New York area. I liked him immediately and accepted his offer, although I knew nothing about astrocytes or GFAP. Somebody know what GFAP is?
Glial fibrillary acidic protein.
Ah, okay. Having done my PhD thesis on serotonin and aplegia. Of course, Bill was an internationally known expert on myelin, but I didn't know a lot about astrocytes either, so we learned together. During that year, Bill introduced me to his colleagues in neurology and neuropathology, Bob Terry, Bob Katzman, Herb Schaumburg, Cedric Rain, Celia Brosnan, Kanuko and Kuni Suzuki, and Dick Hurupian, among many others. What a collection of smart and nice people who convinced me that experimental neuropathology was well worth studying. So I stayed at Einstein for a neuropathology residency, after which I stayed on as faculty for 7 years before moving to Columbia. I was able to work with many of these scientists, and especially with Alex Chu, who shared Bill's and my interest in GFAP and astrocytes. Bill was a tremendous influence on my career as a mentor and a friend. He sponsored me for a K08 NIH grant and allowed me to work at a bench in his space as I was getting started. Bill was a seemingly unending source of scientific wisdom for years. He delivered his wisdom in a very soft-spoken manner, often with a touch of clever wit, which he attributed to his upbringing in Maine. But it was always wise to pay attention to him. He was also a stickler for proper grammatical usage, and I can remember many conversations about the use and misuse of which or that. We kept in touch after I left Einstein at meetings and by phone. I remember him with great fondness and appreciation. Jim Goldman. Sure.
So my name is Laura Norton, and I am Bill's niece. My father was Dick Norton, his older brother. And I have many of the same memories of stories that my father would tell about Vanceboro and growing up in Maine that I've heard today. And I know that Maine was a huge influence in my father and my Uncle Bill's life. My father went to World War II, and when he came back from World War II, he went to Bowdoin and roomed with Uncle Bill for the 4 years while they were in Bowdoin together. Of course, my father always said, whenever he met anybody who wasn't from Bowdoin, he would say, "Oh, you couldn't get into Bowdoin, I guess." That was his standard line. He and Uncle Bill roomed together in Bowdoin for the 4 years, and I know that those were some of the happiest years of his life. He often spoke of those years with great fondness. He died many years ago, in 1986. He had some crazy stories. I think there was lots of drinking involved, quite a lot of smoking involved. Seemed to be a theme for the two of them as brothers. I remember vaguely, and I kind of wish I'd written the story down, but there was some story about dangling somebody out of a window at some point, and then dragging them to the railroad track and leaving them on the tracks, and I'm not quite sure what happened after that, but thankfully I don't think anybody died, which is a good thing. But there was some drinking involved, and anyway, I think the two of them had quite a lot of fun in Bowdoin together. So, even though their lives diverged and they went off and did different things as adults and growing up as kids, we often were in different places. I like to think of the two of them wandering around Vanceboro now, picking wild blueberries and enjoying Vanceboro together.
I'm Don Clark from Fordham University. I knew Bill in a more peripheral way. That is, I worked with Heinrich Welsh at Columbia Medical Center, which was the other big neurochemistry center, where I learned neurochemistry. We were interested in amino acid neurotransmitters, and so we often corresponded. I later moved back to Fordham University, where I'm currently still teaching, and we used to attend seminars at Einstein every now and then, so I remember Bob Ledeen from those days, and many of the other people you mentioned. I used to meet Bill primarily at neurochemistry meetings, rather than the ASN or the ISN meetings. The ISN meetings I remember more exactly because they were in more exotic places, and we had wonderful times together. So I thought I would best also that. I didn't know him that well. I knew him purely professionally, so I didn't know any of the stories that you heard today. Thanks.
Good afternoon, I'm Alex Chiu. It's very hard for me because other than my lovely wife Janet, Bill is the most important person in my adult life. I joined his lab in September 1977 as his postdoc in Einstein, and spent the next 22 years interacting with him on a daily basis. We go to lunch every day. Yes, we took his job very seriously. I can only remember only one time we got him out to see the island. It was because when I got my first research award, and we decided let's go celebrate. And we took the whole group, whole gang out to to see the island. And so Bill's my mentor. And I use present tense intentionally. And I'll come back to that point. I want to focus on what it meant for me, personally, and touch on what he had done for neurochemistry that many of you here have witnessed, but so much more. He has spent so much time with Cooney, and I'm glad to met Dr. Sean Murray, who followed up with Bill in terms of guiding the journals. Bill and Cooney spent 12 years or so at the inflection point of that journal. It was really not a world-class journal until that point. But Bill and Cooney single-handedly, and I use singular at this point because they were like this, to build that journal to a world-class scientific communications that people trust. It is not the Science and Wall Street Journal, New York Times, or those attention-grabbing headlines. This is something solid, okay? And it is, for him, when I talked to Marianne last month, when I tried to see Bill and for one last time, and I missed him by 3 days. Okay. But I didn't think he would want to see me at that time, because, as I say, he's a very proud person. He would not want to see me and say, Alex, you know, how is your family? John, oh, okay, you know. He would not want me to see that. And I never have seen him that point. He was always on. And last time I saw him was 2.5 years ago, just before he has health issues. And he was so proud of the fact they showed me the list of 260 names that he recalled that ever worked with him in Einstein and crossed paths. And half of your names were there. Okay, I digress. But that journal of neurochemistry that he built was set the boundaries of good science. And in that, as I told Marianne, that he was a gardener of the highest caliber. He set the boundary. He set the environment. And he, every now and then, he planted a seed. Jim Goldman, myself. And I want to talk about how that seed grew. Jim and I collaborated very intensely, and in the early 80s, we had several papers that we were very proud of. Okay. And of course, I was paid by Bill. Jim and I using Bill's space, and they have every right. Bill's name should be on our paper. So Jim and I walk into his office and say, we have 2 or 3 manuscripts, and we want to put your name on it. And Bill said, no, don't put my name on it. And at first I thought, oh my God, Jim, this paper must be terrible. But in hindsight, that was not the case, because Bill does not want either Jim or myself to be the middle author. And that's how he mentored. He mentored by creating the environment where you grow, where you have all the nutrients and the sunlight. He cast a very long shadow and he stepped back. And now I finally can say, Bill, you are my mentor. And guess what? 20 years ago when I said that, I was surprised by his reaction. He said, Alex, I'm not your mentor. And now I understand why. Now I mentor others, and those who then mentor others. I understand why the Bill Norton standards of mentoring is to give something up. Okay, it's a parent who let go. Even with your prized BMW, okay, give him the key and let him go. And for that, I owe him a gratitude and debt that will be with me for my entire life. And I look back, and now I'm in a position to support other people who want to be a mentor, to support other people who want to be a trainee. And I always ask that question. Are you going to be like a Bill Norton? Will you take your mentor, like me take the Bill Norton, be able to survive in that environment on your own, not latch on? And as a mentor, will you let go? And I think in that regard, Bill makes such an impact on so many people because he's able to let go and just be there when you need him. His door's always open. I have never, in 22 years, have to make an appointment to see him. Okay, of course, Renee Sasso, his longtime secretaries and I are good friends, so I'm always able to see him anyway. But he would, the door is always open, especially when I walk in and I have a juicy rumor to tell him. He might have to say, Alex, take a seat, let's talk, you know. And he will always be smoking. And at that time, this is, when I left, it was in 2000. And they say, well, by then, New York, you can't smoke, right? So Bill said, no. Dean Purple have classified by this room, this office, as an apartment. You can smoke in your apartment. I said, oh, that makes a lot of sense. But Bill, I would leave you with this thought. I think Bill makes so much impact on other people by stepping back, by he never taught me anything, really. He never taught me anything. After 22 years, he never taught me except once. It's when I try to do a chemical reaction, Ewing degradation, I need to seal a glass tube and bake it, right? And I don't know how to make glass tubes, okay? So he was so animated. I have never seen him so animated because he finally got to do something in the lab. So he and I ran over to Barbara Dean's lab, who has this oxygen tank and an air tank, and he hooked up both of them, and we started making glass. And he was so happy that day, and he was hovering over me, and I finally had to elbow him out of the way. But then, Bill was such a good mentor that he taught me how to write by throwing me into the deep part of the pool. He does not show me how to construct a sentence. He said, send it to the editor and let them send it back to you and I'll go over it. So those are the mentoring that I use the present tense when I began, because he will always be my mentor. He's no longer here, Bill, I'll come to my point. Okay, sorry. He's always, Alex, come to your point. Is that he will always be the beacon that I would seek to guide me going forward. I know it hurts to lose a father. I've been there. 20 years on, I still grieve. And Hamish and Adam, I will grieve for you for the next 20, 30 years. Thank you.
I'm Sean Murphy. 20 years apart, Bill and I both edited Journal of Chemistry. When I took it over, it was a $2 million a year profit-making journal. And it supported all the neurochemistry societies, not the International Society alone, but also the American Society, the European Society, the Society in Japan. But when Bill took it over, as Alex has just mentioned, it was run by an extraordinary individual. Some of you will remember who was the president of Pergamon Press. And Maxwell would not release the journal back to the society. So he had founded the journal, that's true. He was reaping enormous financial benefits from the journal, and none of it was coming back to the society. And there was a huge court case, and if you're interested, it's a wonderful story. And in the end, Maxwell lost in the High Court in England. And the journal came to the society and then became the super journal, super money-making, science-supporting journal that it is today. But I met Bill in England after his sabbatical, because Bill was the competition. We had published papers on cell separation, and then Bill and Shirley came out with the 1970 paper in Science, which was huge. And of course, it was a better paper, better method than we had thought we perfected. And so Bill was the competition, but that didn't matter. And we shared a common interest in nicotine, so Bill and I would often meet outside meetings, me, graduate student, working their way up, Bill 20 years ahead, and we'd talk. And when I took over the journal, Bill had already told me what to do. So, those are my memories.
Any more volunteers?
Hi. This is going to be a completely different perspective. I never even studied chemistry in high school. I knew almost nothing of what Bill did. I knew where he worked, and I remember once asking him if somebody asked me, what do you do? And in a sentence or two, he refined down something that he figured a layman like me would understand, and I've since forgotten it. But that was the extent of my connection to him professionally. Okay, Bill married into our family. He had 6 sisters and 5 sisters-in-law. We were 6 girls and a boy. He married my oldest sister. Mary and I, the twin sister, were the youngest. I remember when we found out that we called my sister Buzzy, and she had a boyfriend from Maine. Maine? Anyway, we finally met Bill, and I have to say that even through the years, he was endlessly fascinating to me as a person. He was unaware of it probably, but I studied him. I always wanted to be more like him. He was so completely different, not only from my other brothers-in-law, but from our family, our neighbors, our friends in the Bronx. It seemed to me that he was endlessly, continuously confident and poised and quiet. That's the impression I got. And I invested him with every kind of virtue you could imagine. In later years as an adult, speaking with my sister about my own relationships and hers, obviously I learned he was as human as any of the rest of us. But I never, even to the very end, I was impressed by the way he carried himself. Psychologically, he expressed himself in a much more effective way, probably, than any of us did, because he was succinct, never an extra word. He never, well, other people spoke about this, he was as modest as the day is long. I remember thinking, wow, how come Bill doesn't sort of, I don't know what I expected him to do, but he was always himself, quiet. I remember going on a trip to Iceland. Before I left, he said, do you have a camera, a good camera? I said, no, not really. And he loaned me his best camera.
At first I was afraid to accept it, but I did, and I took extraordinary slides, which I still look at. I remember the time when my father died suddenly. Bill was the one who we called. I remember the instant he came into our house, the situation changed for me. My father's death was still terribly shocking, but if Bill was there, it seemed that everything would probably be okay, be under control. When I was in art school, this is interesting. I had never seen a scene that I made an etching of. It was something from my mind and something probably that I had heard Bill speak about. I made an etching of a dock with a broken down shack. This was my sense of what it must have looked like in Maine, because he spoke of his own grandfather and lobster fishing. And when I showed it to him, he said, "Can I have that?" I was sort of shocked. I was flattered, sort of shocked. And I gave it to him. He framed it, and it stayed in the living room of their house. There were a lot of quiet things that he did that were tremendously effective, and I understood that from him alone. It was the people I lived with, the people around me were so different. Whatever Bill said seemed to me to have a stronger, deeper meaning. Whatever he didn't say, I remember thinking, maybe it's just as well not to speak about things like that. So there are an enormous number of lessons I think I learned from him. As I say, I studied him all through the years. He was unaware, but he made a tremendous impression. He was so different from anyone that we had known before. In later years, I moved out to Minnesota and lived there for a year in Middle America, and I realized how similar the people were to the one person that I knew in New York, who was Bill, and yet he was the best of all of them that I knew. He was somebody that our family depended on. He was always there, and he was always a calming, intelligent, caring influence. And I think that's what stays with me about him, is my aspiring still to have that same sort of calm. And yet my sister told me, "You may not be completely right." She knew him, and she said he was not always us, as none of us are. But this is the sense that I have of him, and probably always will.
My name is Herbert Denbitzer. I knew Bill for many years. We carpooled from Westport to the Bronx. And well, I thought Bill was perhaps one of the smartest, most decent, honest men I ever knew. I have something else to talk about, which is his sense of the absurd. I thought it was a very strong part of his personality. And I have two examples of that. And most of you know Einstein is part of Yeshiva University, which is Jewish and supposed to be kosher. Supposedly, the dining room supposed to be kosher. And somebody in Bill's lab, he tells me, ordered a roast beef and cheese sandwich, which is not kosher. You're not allowed to mix dairy and meat. And they sent it up, somebody not knowing what's going on. And after that, shortly after that, somebody comes tearing up to his lab and saying, "I must have the knife that cut it, because that would make them kosher." Bill looked at him and said, "Go away," and laughed uproariously about it. But the best story I heard was when he was at DuPont, where they were very proud of this, I guess, polymer laboratory, and an oven they had that had to be kept at very strict temperatures. And they bragged about how good this oven was, until Bill finally found out that the needle was stuck. I swear to God, and nobody knew just what temperature it was going to run at. That's what it was.
Anybody else? Well, there's nothing that says we have to go all the way to 5. And maybe we don't have to. It's 4:30, why don't we call it a day? Thank you.